The broadcast called it a training exercise, but anyone who had ever seen a real war knew the difference between choreography and fear. 12 of the Council's most expensive warships slid into position over the pale clouds of Cristaros, their hulls gleaming like carved obsidian. Commentators sold the spectacle in calm voices to 40 billion viewers. Analysts traced predictive arcs across the display. Children in dormitories pressed faces to screens and asked parents who would win. No one asked what would happen if something uninvited stepped onto the stage. On the human bench of the observation ring, Captain Mara Keating stood with her hands behind her back, chin high, eyes restless. She wore the uniform of a liaison, not a conqueror. Charcoal fabric, no medals, the thin silver braid of Earth's diplomatic corps at her shoulder. Her job was to look calm when the galaxy practiced violence politely. The first shot came from a Keth dreadnought, the kind of weapon that would have made a civilization kneel 3 centuries ago. It lanced across the void in a clean arc and broke into a soft rain of light before it reached its target. The crowd thought it was a special effect. The commanders knew it wasn't. Field damping? Someone muttered. False, there's no thermal bleed. Another voice, softer. Then what the hell? The intruder had not decloaked. It had appeared as if the simulation had been written with a blank space where a ship should be. It hovered at the exact center of the formation, so unremarkable in shape that Mara's mind kept sliding off it. No heat signature, no drive plume, just a suggestion of a hull, a curve that refused to make up its mind about being there. Unidentified vessel. The Daryl Admiral snapped across the open channel, and a dozen translations flattened the anger into something crisp and ceremonial. You have entered a restricted military zone. Identify yourself or be fired upon. The voice that answered did not shout to carry, it didn't need to. If you insist on practicing with dull knives, the speaker said, you should at least keep them sheathed. Human, male, older measured, a timbre that remembered classrooms, not battlefields. Around the ring, diplomats turned their heads toward Mara because she was the closest human with a badge they could stare at. She didn't move. The council ships fired because that is what doctrine demanded when common sense froze. 12 independent systems, engineered across species and centuries, converged on one unmarked target. The result should have been an ugly tangle of physics and fire. Instead, it was clean. Flare after flare dimmed into nothingness, not deflected but accepted, the way a lake accepts a stone and refuses to ripple back. Shields did not fail, they were never invited to the conversation. One by one, the warships blinked. The blinking was not in the lights but in the data. Targeting reticles lost depth. Sensor cones returned perfect silence. Engines remained warm and obedient, yet every thruster command arrived at the wrong moment with exquisite precision, as if time itself had been politely rearranged by a patient teacher. On the Keth flagship, an officer shouted for a diagnostic. The diagnostic returned a green field so flawless it should have been terrifying. "We're not offline," someone whispered. "We're outclassed." Mara's breath sat like a weight at the base of her ribs. She had seen declassifications no one else in the ring had seen, footnotes buried under other footnotes. There were names you heard at the academy in the way you hear legends. Dr. Athen Gold's Field Harmonics, the Orpheus Memorandum. The word Asterian spoken once, softly, and then scrubbed from the syllabus. There was also a place every human cadet learned to mark on the star charts with a neat circle and a warning, Vesper Belt. Survey discontinued. "What do we call it?" the commentator asked into the noise of his own courage. "The intruder, the ghost?" A Crary analyst leaned into a mic as if leaning toward fire. "We call it a teacher." The teacher graded without malice. After 40 seconds, 3 council ships found themselves blind and docile. At 90 seconds, 5 more could feel every switch under every panel and could not persuade a single one to listen. A Sulari cruiser attempted a cold reboot and discovered its reboot had been anticipated and transformed into a loop. A T-Zen battle carrier shivered as every weapon's battery declared itself healthy, then declared itself on break. Through it all, the unknown ship rotated lazily as if reading. "Are you seeing the same thing I am?" the Daryl Admiral asked, now forgetting to speak for an audience. "No heat spike, no EM lash, they're not attacking, they're synchronizing." The word drifted through the ring and clung to everything. At 2 minutes, the intruder spoke again. "This isn't war," the voice said, and Mara could not stop herself from gripping the rail. "This is a reminder." A hush fell as if the room itself had a pulse and it had skipped. "Of what?" a Sulari diplomat demanded. "Of the bill you deferred," the voice replied, almost kindly. A blossom of ion mist puffed from a dozen hulls at once, the ritual touch of a graceful referee, and all 12 warships announced with perfect sincerity that they were going to sleep. The intruder paused as if to sign its work. It did not give a name. It gave a sentence, broadcast on open gravimetric carriers that made translation unnecessary. "Next time, practice with something real." It vanished in a fold so small the instruments argued about whether they had seen it. The crowd reacted the way crowds always do when a story stops at the exact second it becomes a myth, first with denial, then with a hunger that felt like worship. On the human bench, someone finally found the voice to ask Mara a question. She didn't answer. She was thinking of the Vesper Belt and of a vote taken 2 centuries ago by people who believed history could be filed. Above Cristaros, the light show ended. Inside 1,000 rooms, the lesson began. The High Commission chamber had been designed to make argument sound like music. Today, it made panic sound civilized. The walls projected banners of 100 sovereignties. The central dais replayed the humiliation not as spectacle, but as evidence. Mara Keating stood 3 steps behind the human delegation's lead counselor and tried to make her body look like it belonged to someone who had never heard the word Asterian. "Identify the vessel," demanded Counselor Thrin of the Sulari Compact. His skin flashed with an anger that his species usually reserved for storms. "If it speaks like a human, moves like a human craft, and uses human carriers, then it is yours." "It is not ours," Counselor James Rook replied. He did not add, "It was ours once, in the way a parent is once responsible for a child who grows into something the parent never imagined." A carry technologist spoke with the precision of a lab report. "No thermal plume, no radiative tail, hull reflection nearly null. Interaction suggests field resonance overlays applied to power distribution matrices. If this is human, it is not contemporary human." He turned slightly toward the human bench, and this time the room did not pretend it wasn't an accusation. Mara had asked for permission to speak in private earlier and was told to wait until the room felt like it needed a confession. The room needed one now. She stepped forward at Rook's nod and felt 50 species tilt toward her. 230 years ago, she said, a Terran initiative was proposed under classified oversight, Asterian. The word floated out like dust and hung in the light. Its mandate was to develop post-kinetic doctrine, systems that end conflict by invalidating it. The Council pressured Earth to disarm after the Serlin Accords. We complied. Asterian did not. We exiled the project team into the Vesper Belt. Counselor Thrin blinked. Exile, the syllables tasted like old law, to a region marked unstable and unmonitored. The instability, Mara said, keeping her voice level, is not moral. It is temporal. She tapped a holo key and sent data they had always hoped not to show. The Vesper model rotated in the air, a nest of folds, shears, noisy echoes. 1 year external equals 5 to 7 internal by our best readings. We sent our heretics to a monastery where time prayed faster. A long, brittle silence settled. Somewhere high above, the chamber's climate system sighed. Then came the questions the way rain comes once the sky gives up pretending. How many were sent? With what seed tech? What oversight remained? What exactly did you think they would become? 28, Mara answered. Systems theorists, war ethicists, rogue AI programmers who argued that autonomy without accountability is tyranny in prettier clothes. They were brilliant and unbearable, and when consensus felt fragile, we found a way to make them elsewhere. She didn't say the other part. They chose exile over silence. Rook took the next blow. We archived them, he said. Under legal cover and euphemism, we told ourselves we were choosing peace. Perhaps we were only choosing not to be reminded. He looked older than he had that morning. A Daryl analyst pinched and spread the simulation feed until it became a map of failure states annotated in alien glyphs. They didn't destroy, they induced compliance. Life support never dipped. Weapons took naps. Engines agreed with bad advice. This is not conquest, this is curriculum design. The chamber loved phrases like that because they had handles. Curriculum design trended across 10 languages in as many minutes. Outside, a billion feeds argued about whether being taught without consent is a kind of violence. Inside, Counselor Tren of the Harkali Dominion said the quiet fear out loud. Contain the human sectors until the truth is known. Quarantine buys time. Admiral Oren Dax of the Krari fleet cut through the murmur, voice like a blade kept sharp for emergencies. Motion denied. We cannot blockade a council member because a ghost wrote better code than we did. He turned to the human bench. But you will open every archive you have. If your exiles are now a nation, we will learn their language. Rook nodded. Mara watched the nod like a sentence being signed. Within the hour, in a vault beneath Luna Prime, locks that had not moved in generations rotated with the tired sigh of old metal taught to behave like stone. Inside, the air smelled like nothing because it had been cleaned of time. Holograms blinked awake like eyes that had decided to forgive. Asterian's records were a collage of arguments and prototypes, equations that looked like music, test beds that looked like heresy. Volunteers wired to early neural lattices, debating not only what could be done, but what should be permitted to do it. A younger professor with sleep in his beard said, "It's not about more power. It's about refusing the game where power is scored." An ethicist with a scar at her mouth whispered, "If you can end a war before it starts, you must. But who decides what counts as beginning?" Mara stood with Admiral Hale, the kind of officer who wore his conscience as visibly as his rank, and watched names scroll past. Some she recognized only as statues in the Academy's garden. Others had never been carved into stone because the vote that exiled them had also erased their right to be remembered. Hale pointed at a transfer order highlighted in pale red. "We didn't send them to die," he said, almost convincing himself. "We sent them where their work couldn't break us." "They built where we wouldn't look," Mara said. "Time did the rest." An alert chimed, subtle, careful. The council wanted a scientific convening at the Hellespont Observatory on Idris, neutral ground where politics had to knock before entering. The galaxy would ask what Asterian had become. Mara wondered whether the more urgent question wasn't simpler and more dangerous. What had Asterian remembered that everyone else had chosen to forget? When the chamber adjourned for the night, the arguments did not stop. They only went home with people and slept beside them. Mara stared at the ceiling of her temporary quarters and thought of Vesper's folds like pages in a closed book. Inside that book, somebody had been writing for centuries. Today, they had placed a chapter on the council's desk. The Hellespont Observatory was a cathedral to curiosity. Glass and stone and vacuum-sealed air that tasted like nothing and therefore like everything. Scientists gathered in ascending rings, their species a parade of solutions nature had tried on its way to intelligence. At the center, a rotating model of the Vesper belt through soft light into faces already pale from too much thinking and too little sleep. Professor Emmett Vale, a Terran who had once resigned from a government post rather than sign a document whose ethics he could not pronounce without coughing, took the floor. His hands moved the way teachers' hands move when they know the lesson is half geometry, half confession. "We read Vesper wrong," he said. "We filed a glitch under dangerous and walked away, but a glitch is also a door if you ask it a better question." He pushed the model wider. Shear layers peeled like onion skin, revealing resonance nodes strung through the belt like beads. Time here is not constant, Vale continued, but neither is it chaos. It is negotiable. If you can persuade the fabric to remember a different rhythm, you can make conversations happen out of order. Asterion had centuries in a century. Iteration becomes culture. A Daryl physicist with limbs like chiseled glass offered a guarded nod. Assuming they survived the first decade. They did more than survive, Vale said, and spun up a reconstruction based on the intruder's signature. What we witnessed over Cristaros was a cognitive field architecture, what some of us used to call fantasy because it refused to fit in our labs. Call it a choir of machines singing the right notes at the right frequencies until other systems forgot their own songs. He paused, aware that metaphors can be sedatives. In plainer words, they don't push harder. They rewrite the rules that tell pushing what to do. An Adroy engineer raised a coppery hand. No damage to life support suggests constraint engines with ethical governors. That implies not only power but doctrine. On a secondary display, the simulation timeline unfolded with fresh overlays. Red marks showed where a kinetic civilization would have fired. The intruder's path traced blue circles around the red, like a teacher's pen refusing to shame. Doctrine, Vale agreed. Asterion's original mandate was post-kinetic. The exile hardened that into a faith. A Crari biologist adjusted an ocular band and frowned. We keep using they as if biology changed. Your scans say no forced mutation. Then what precisely are we calling them now? Vale did not enjoy this part, but honesty had been the condition of his return to public work. A human is a species and a story. The species remained. The story changed. Extended cognition braided with machine chorus. Reflex arcs that anticipate by measuring fields rather than waiting for photons. We are watching the first descendants of an idea we refuse to raise. The phrase new type humans did not originate there, but that was where it stopped being rumor. It made some people taste iron. It made others taste relief, as if a word could carry the weight of being wrong and make it bearable. General Hale, patched in by secure relay from Luna Prime, did not flinch theatrically. Say it clean, Professor. They are still human, Vale said, but also more practiced at being the part of us that learns under pressure. The room absorbed it like medicine, bitter necessary. A Sulari linguist leaned toward her mic. The voice that spoke on the open channel, do we have a match? Partial, an aide answered. The cadence maps to archived subject Orion Cade, strategist, Asterion principal, last seen at Vesper transfer. The timbre confirms age beyond council standard by Vesper factors. Mara Keating felt the name fall through her like a key through a grate. Orion Cade had written the white paper that made her want to be a soldier before it was politically fashionable to admit that wanting to be a soldier meant wanting responsibility. He had also walked into exile like a man stepping onto a ship to a country he intended to build from grammar. A sharp tone interrupted the academic music. The observatory's outer relay declared with polite urgency that a gravimetric pulse had brushed 3 fringe stations and gone quiet. It carried a message without encryption or signature because signature is what you offer when you need permission to speak. The message said, "We require memory, not a throne." Historically, civilizations have thrown armies at sentences like that. Today, the room threw questions. Is this warning? Invitation? A test? A theology? A joke? Mara asked, the only one that felt useful. What would satisfy them? Vale looked at her as one teacher looks at another across a hallway. We cannot give what we refuse to keep, he said. But we can try something harder, admitting we exiled a part of ourselves and calling it by its name when it knocks. In the back tier, a young Sulari student who had snuck into the session under the pretense of carrying a professor's satchel whispered to the friend beside her, "If they come home, does that mean we're all about to live in a harder story?" Her friend didn't answer. The model of Vesper turned slowly on its axis, and there was a moment, only a moment, when every mind in the room moved in the same direction at once, the way starlings make a cloud from disagreement. Then the moment passed, as moments do when you are not ready to say yes to them. Mara stepped outside into Idris' thin sunlight and called home. Her mother's message spool chimed like the past trying to be helpful. "We saw the footage," her mother said. "Your uncle says he always knew the council would need us again. Your aunt says she always knew we'd need ourselves." Then, softer, "Be careful, kiddo. There's the kind of power that makes people behave and the kind that makes them become. The second kind scares leaders more." Mara smiled without humor. "The second kind also saves children," she said, "if we let it." She looked up, as if looking up could shorten the distance to where the intruder had gone. Somewhere beyond sight, a door was open. The scary part wasn't that someone could walk through. It was that they might be waiting for the rest of the class to arrive. The first reaction was bureaucratic. Alerts cascading like falling shelves, red banners across command consoles, secure lines warmed to body temperature by overuse. The second reaction was cultural. Songs with new chords, street murals in low-orbit habitats that painted a ship as a question mark, feeds that replaced profile icons with the phrase we remember in languages that could not agree on how many plurals memory deserved. On Calyx Prime, the Lucari fleet reviewed casualty projections against an adversary that did not shoot. The numbers came back obscene for every scenario that involved pride. Admiral Vesk rubbed the ridge of cartilage above his eyes and said, "Then we do not shoot first." On Tesh's capital Moon, the Kazathi Alliance declared its withdrawal from the Mutual Defense Pact with a statement so poetically phrased. It took 2 hours for markets to understand it was a threat dressed as a poem. In the Terran outer colonies, a debate broke out that sounded uncomfortably like love. Should the exiles be welcomed as kin who had taken a longer road, or as strangers carrying mirrors sharp enough to cut? At Earth's Strategic Intelligence Corps, General Hale stood in front of a wall of gray-haired officers and turned the volume down on status reports long enough to hear himself think. "Erase nothing," he said. "We will not survive this century if our first reflex is to bury the memo that hurts us." A junior analyst burst into the room because sometimes stories need someone young enough to forget to knock. "Sir," she said out of breath, "a dormant relay lit under Jupiter's ring. Antiquated protocol, Asterian era, bypassed everything. It pushed us a file." The file was a lesson plan. The Cristero's exercise unfolded again, no commentary, no hero angles. Just brutal annotations in orthography no one had taught but everyone could read. Blind spots circled, latencies underlined, hubris highlighted so neatly it felt like kindness. The last page contained 4 words in an old Terran font. "You can do better." In the council chamber, the same file reached species who had never written in fonts. Counselors read in tight-lipped silence, then looked at one another with the difficult honesty professionals save for private rooms. "This is a correction." Some took offense at the pedagogy. Others took notes. A Daryl strategist who had spent a career mastering the choreography of Force stood, closed his eyes for a breath, and reopened them with the relief that attends humiliation accepted. "We are not failing because we are weak," he said. "We are failing because we are rehearsing." Civilian nets did what civilian nets do. They turned fear into performance and then into policy. On Mars, Governor Aditi Rao went live with a speech that would be taught in schools because it admitted everything and promised only work. "If we want a future with them," she said, meaning the exiles and not saying the word because saying the word felt like casting a spell, "we must be worth the conversation." Across a thin band of space nobody bothered to chart, the intruder returned without spectacle. The gravimetric whisper touched 3 listening posts like a finger tapping a shoulder. The message that wrote it was not encrypted because encryption is for secrets, and this was a principle. We seek friendship where memory is honored. We refuse hierarchy disguised as peace. on a back channel licensed to the Terran Diplomatic Corps, but maintained by the sort of volunteers who think vigilance is a civic art. Mara Keating sent a reply that would be recorded later as an official communication only because someone with the right stamp decided humility could be retroactively authorized. "We remember you," she wrote. "We exiled you. We taught the galaxy to pretend you were gone. If you will meet us, we will begin by naming the wrong thing the right way." No one expected an answer because power seldom answers quickly. The answer arrived in the manner of a courteous neighbor ringing a bell. The lights dimmed in one room only, the small, ridiculous, stubbornly unfancy chamber Earth used for interstellar calls before it could afford better ones. A man stood in the projection, not against banners but against quiet. He was not young, but he wore age the way a blade wears a scabbard, necessary, honest. His voice braided regret with resolve. "Captain Keating," he said, and the way he said her name made her feel as if she were being graded for a class she had wanted to take since she was a child. "I am Orion Cade. We left as your colleagues. We grew into something you did not make but did begin." He lifted his chin a fraction. "We are home if home is a shared future." Mara swallowed the lump that wanted to turn into rhetoric. "What do you want?" she asked because the room needed the question short. "A fair sentence," Cade said, almost smiling. "Not a throne, not amnesty. An honest account of what you did and what we did with what you did. Start there, then we will trade teachers." "You intend to teach us?" Cade's eyes warmed by a degree which in men like him is a confession. "I intend to be taught, too. We did not become more human by refusing to listen." He looked aside then, as if consulted by someone not in the frame. When he looked back, the old Terran habit of humor softened the edge of a sentence that would change budgets and boundaries and breakfast tables. "Also," he said, "stop letting your admirals rehearse. Rehearsal convinces you the audience is the point." The feed cut on a curve so graceful it felt like a bow. The room did not breathe for 2 heartbeats. Then people did what people do when they realize that history has stopped asking for permission. They started moving. The council declared an emergency convocation not to vote for war, but to vote for vocabulary. The Terran Assembly drafted a resolution recognizing Asterian descendants as a sovereign human polity with full dignity and no leash, then argued for 20 hours about whether dignity requires treaties or only behavior. The outer colonies formed citizen committees to inventory their own amnesia. Children in 3 systems asked teachers if exile is always a bad word. Teachers met after school to agree to tell the truth gently. That night, Mara sat alone in a room that still smelled faintly of chalk from a century when teaching had visible dust. She wrote a letter she had no authority to send to a man whose voice had climbed into the part of her mind where duty keeps its list. "You said you are home if home is a shared future. I don't know if we deserve that, but I know how to try. Tomorrow I will ask the Assembly to declassify our worst decisions. The day after I will ask our children to read them. If you are what we become when we are not allowed to forget, then make us remember better." She didn't hit send. She printed it on paper because sometimes the soul believes words more when it can feel them. Then she slept, which felt like treason and turned out to be preparation. At dawn, a child's drawing went viral on a colony where viral still meant a notice pinned to a communal board. A mess of stars, a small ship in the middle, a caption in a careful hand, "Please come home and also teach US how to be kind and brave." The board filled with responses, not from admirals or counselors, but from the tired, hopeful multitudes who survive empires. Mara saw it hours later and understood what Cade had meant. Thrones were easy, sentences were hard. The work finally had moved to where it belonged, and somewhere beyond the Vesper Belt, in a time that ran a little faster and therefore had practiced a little longer, a ship curved in a space that refused to decide whether it was present. Work lights came on. People still human, stubbornly human, took their places at consoles that responded to thought and to conscience. They were not coming to conquer, they were coming to participate. "Class," someone said, smiling the way teachers smile when they love the lesson and the lives on the other side of it. "Begin." They called it the Day of Open Folders, which was a ridiculous name for an act that felt like a confession and sounded like an oath. At 0900 Sol Standard, the Terran Assembly declassified enough material to break a century of euphemism. The stream didn't open with a politician. It opened with a camera without filters and a librarian with hair like an unmade bed saying, "Here is what we hid from you and why. Here is what it cost." Then the flood. People watched at bus stops and in barracks, in orbital laundries and oxygen farms, on break rooms wrapped in the bored hum of machines. Teachers rolled in old projectors because some of them still trusted light on a wall more than light on a palm. Children raised hands no one called on yet. In the documents, the vote that exiled Asterion was revealed in long, careful paragraphs that read like a plea and a verdict sharing a suit. The rationale: peace needs quiet. The dissent: quiet isn't peace when it is purchased by forgetting. Mara Keating watched from a room with an actual window because she had asked for one after too many months in windowless knowing. She didn't take notes. She let the honesty do what honesty does when you give it the room: sting, then breathe. Down in the comments, cruelty tried to make a living as usual and empathy outbid it. Her console chimed with a message from her mother. "You were 6 when you asked me why people whisper. I told you sometimes voices are too big for rooms that are too small. Make the room bigger." The council's reaction was a chorus of reluctant respect and predictable fear. Some delegates said, "In so many dialects, we appreciate your candor. Now stop before it is inconvenient." Others wanted to draft an accord of candor and stamp it with enough ceremony to look like action. The Harkali came armed with an old proposal under a new name: containment. The Krari maintained the posture of professionals who refused to be surprised by realities and only by how long it took others to notice them. Across feeds, one sentiment kept rising from the part of the galaxy that paid rent on its hope: "Thank you for telling the truth." What next? Before anyone could answer, the wrong kind of next arrived. Someone leaked a private memo from a defense contracting block whose members had been very polite during the hearings and very rude in secret. The memo described a plan called Velvet Net, a quiet coalition of fleets to shadow Asterian vessels under the premise of protection and the practice of leash-making. It was deniable. It was clever. It required Asterion to be foolish enough to hold still. Orion Cade didn't wait for reporters. He appeared without announcement in a council-side chamber not wired for grand speeches, just good microphones. He had the bad habit of speaking as if words belonged to people first and to institutions second. "We have read Velvet Net," he said, because exiles learn early that secrets are only whether on the way to the climate. "We decline your leash. We decline your fear on our behalf. We accept your honesty and offer ours." He offered the terms not as demands but as a syllabus: no kinetic rehearsal in civilian zones, no secret theaters whose tickets are stamped with children's lives, no policing of thought disguised as safety. In exchange, open access to Asterion's constraint doctrine to any fleet willing to rewrite its pride. Field liaison exchanges where council scientists could sit inside the choir and learn how to think with machines that thought back with manners. A joint working group dedicated to the ethics of power that can end a war without firing. "You want of us what we wanted of ourselves," Cade said. "To be needed by being honest." In the background of the stream, Mara saw an Asterian technician glance off camera the way people do when they are receiving a wordless question and answering with a hand. She wanted to ask what it felt like to be part of a chorus on purpose. She wanted to ask what it cost. The cost showed up that night. It began as a small wrongness recorded by a sensor boy hugging the outer edge of the Vesper model. A tug in the fabric like a sigh someone forgot to turn into words. Idris Observatory flagged it green. Anomalies were the belt's love language, and then flagged it yellow when the tug came again. Professor Vale was at his desk with soup because his doctor had said soup might teach his nerves gentler habits. He was halfway through a spoon when the alarm made the soup suddenly smell like the future. The ripple was not a visitor, it was the belt coughing. Fold shears weaved wrong. The harmonics drifted out of poem and into stutter. The observatory's predictive engine, which had gotten cocky in the last week about its ability to anticipate mischief, flattened into humility. If the stutter propagated, it would reach settled lanes and teach everyone the hardest lesson in astrophysics. The map is an apology the universe makes for not being simple. Vale pinged the Crary fleet, the Darrow long-range array, Earth's sleepy night shift, anyone with a screen and responsibility. The replies came in at the speed of bureaucracy trying to pretend it had always planned for this exact weirdness. Too slow. Mara paced the narrow stripe of floor between her window and her whole job, calling names, calling in favors, calling the part of herself that knew who to ask. She didn't call Orion Cade. She typed and deleted his name twice because pride and fear had decided to file a joint petition under restraint. He called her. "You see it," he said, not as a question. "I see it," she said, and realized she had not taken a breath since the boys' first report. "I think we need a classroom," he said, "large enough to fit a few fleets and an honest mistake." They chose Wren's Gap, a corridor of clean space skirting the belt's misbehavior where commerce usually threaded a safe needle. Asterion seeded the area with a visible mesh of listening points, each blinking a color that meant, "We are paying attention in a way that cannot be faked." The Council's ships approached with weapons politely cold and egos politely hot. Earth sent 2 carriers and a prayer disguised as a checklist. Civilians watched because no one had thought to tell them not to, and because you cannot teach a galaxy and then ask it to look away. Cade spoke first, this time with a teacher's cadence you give to a room you think might be generous. "We will arrest the ripple together," he said. "We will show you the interface. We will do it with consent. A choral protocol requires more than hands. It requires promises." The promises had nouns, no recording without agreement, no training simulations mislabeled for plausible deniability, no measurement of minds without the mind's signatures in ink and in choice. The Council scribes looked like people asked to sign a device they knew they needed and feared to admit they were not trained to use. They signed. Asterion opened a space like a door that felt like a welcome. The interface was not cables and clamps. It was an invitation. Mara volunteered because she understood that diplomacy sometimes means being the first idiot willing to try the thing, so you can assure the cautious that being careful does not always mean being late. They took her hand and her consent, brought her into a room that hummed like a liturgy written for machines, and asked her to think about the first lie she ever told that hurt someone she loved. She did. The room met the thought, didn't exploit it, didn't fix it, just matched its shape and offered her the grace of being believed. Then they asked her to think about the rhythm of the ripple outside, the way it climbed and hiccuped. She listened and found, to her surprise, that the memory of the lie and the stutter of the belt had shapes that rhymed, unresolved, both of them. "Promise to resolve," an Asterion engineer said softly. "Not to erase, not to overpower, to resolve." She promised. The chorus, human voices, machine voices, not distinct so much as companionable, braided around her like a scarf that adjusted to the weather. She became, for 7 minutes, part of an instrument built by people who had learned to make conscience a control surface. They sang, not with throats, but with will made careful. The ripple heard the song like a weather vane hears wind and decided, after a hesitant measure, to turn. The stutter slowed. The mesh points blinked a color that would later be standardized as resolved without harm. The Crary captain, who had come ready to disdain anything that required a heart of any kind, removed his gloves and swore, later in private, that he had felt something like gratitude. Admiral Hale whispered, "We just watched discipline become technology." Professor Vale cried because sometimes the body refuses to keep secrets even when the mind could. When it was done, the class applauded the only way a class of professionals can, by pretending they had always expected the lesson to go well and then staying late to ask too many questions. The last question was a knife wrapped in a flower. "If we can do this," a Daryl strategist asked, "will you help us do it to anyone who threatens us?" Cade's answer was a boundary spoken with a kindness that hurt. "We will help you learn to do it yourselves. We will help you keep your promises. We will not be your sword." He looked across the room as if listening to a music no one else could hear. "We are still human. Part of that is refusing to confuse competence with permission." That night, Mara stood alone, nursing tea gone cold the way ideals sometimes go when you leave them unattended. She wrote 2 letters and sent one. The sent one went to her mother. It worked. "Are you afraid?" The reply came 8 minutes later. "I am afraid of the days when it doesn't, and less afraid because you are in the room where you can help it." The unsent letter was to Orion Cade. It said, "What does it cost to build a choir that knows when to be quiet?" She didn't send it because some questions deserve to live a while before they are asked aloud. Out beyond Vesper, the Asterian vessel dimmed its working lights. The choir dispersed to sleep like any night shift. Someone laughed in a hallway about soup and stubs a toe. On a bulkhead, a child's drawing fastened by actual tape listed as air moved. A ship, a door, a sentence in block letters, "Be kind and brave." Cade touched the tape with a finger like a promise and walked on. Morning would come. Morning always came. The difference now was that more people were awake in time to greet it. There is a kind of politics that hates silence because it cannot sell tickets to it. Within a week of Wren's Gap, 3 blocks that had shaken hands with the accord of candor began whittling their signatures into decorative shapes. A rumor whispered in 12 languages that Asterion had planted the ripple just to perform competence. Another rumor said the choir was a mind trap, an invasive vine disguised as a violin. The rumors carried the fingerprints of the velvet net contingent, angry that their leash unraveled into string and story. Mara's office became a ferry terminal for alarms. One feed showed a talking head weighing the moral hazard of humility. Another displayed a petition calling for a referendum on whether sovereign dignity could survive an admission of error. A clip of Cade saying "we are still human" was cut to emphasize "still" like a threat. The journalist labeled nuance as if it were breaking news. "Go back on," General Hale said to Mara in a meeting full of faces and too little oxygen. "Tell them the thing we tell rookies with good aim. You can be right and wrong in the same minute. That's why training exists, and that's why training isn't real." He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Also, tell them this isn't training." She went on camera and didn't try to be charming. She tried to be accurate in a way that could live beside fear without catching it. "We don't have new gods," she said. "We have new neighbors we abandoned and who learned to do our shared homework. If you're scared, you have company. If you think fear should be policy, you have history as a warning label." She asked for patience and offered the schedule for the first Joint Constraint Practicum, a series of live drills where council captains would practice de-escalating a problem before it became a casualty count. No munition rounds, no unannounced surprises, no worship of cleverness. The charter used the word consent 7 times, and an intern accidentally left one instance in all caps. The council chuckled and kept it. On the morning of Practicum 1, a string of freighters drifted near the designated exercise zone as if commerce had gotten lost. The freighters' transponders were new, too new. Asterion's mesh hummed a caution that sounded to the trained like a chord missing the note that made it kind. Mara watched the trajectory lines and felt her throat do the old soldier thing, where it narrates the worst before the mind can negotiate the better. "Is this part of the practicum?" A Crari liaison asked calmly enough to be a person trying to model calm. "No," Cade said, somewhere just outside the frame, the way you say no to a child reaching for a stove. "This is rehearsal pretending to be war." The freighters bloomed into a net designed to scramble the mesh, an elegant, ugly trick, flood the listening architecture with lies until the choir could no longer agree on the key. The move carried the smell of velvet net, good at money, bad at metaphors. They'd hired a mercenary outfit to stage the sabotage and make it look like Asterion had lost their pitch. If the choir fell out of tune, the story would write itself. It didn't. The chorus dipped into a narrower band, then narrower still, shedding harmonics until only a thin wire of consent carried the load. It sang quiet enough to surprise the sabotage into missing. The freighter net flashed a bewildered orange on Mara's display, then sauntered through a half-baked retreat. A Daryl captain suggested with admirable composure that they be pursued and detained. "No," Cade said again, and something in the room relaxed because you can tell a lot about a neighbor by how they pick their no. Later, in a smaller room with bad coffee and good chairs, the Practicum partners voted to publish footage of the attempted sabotage. The motion passed with the sort of relief that tastes like honesty finally catching up to rumor. The Velvet Net Coalition dissolved itself preemptively, issuing a statement that read like a man quitting a job before anyone can fire him. One of its architects blamed the optics of transparency. The symmetry made Professor Vale smile like a tired uncle. Between drills, the ethics group met in a windowed hall where the view tired the eyes with too much sky. They named things. Names matter. Constraint, for the art of refusing harm even when harm would be easier. Civic consent, for the practice of teaching citizens not only what is being done, but how it feels from the inside. A Sulari ethicist argued, with the fierceness of one who once believed rules could be made elegant enough to save everyone, that Asterion's doctrine should be codified as treaty language. An adroit jurist countered gently that codification without culture built thrones for bureaucrats. They wrote a preamble anyway and promised to reopen it every year and in emergencies. Mara and Cade met 3 times that week in rooms that had never expected to host myth. The first meeting smelled like old carpet and new responsibility. They traded apologies not as currency but as scaffolding. He told her a story about the first winter in Vesper when their tents sang from ice and people learned to huddle not only for heat. She told him about a summer on Mars when her unit had been given a mission that made sense only if you cut it into pieces and threw away the edges. He laughed once, which surprised both of them. The second meeting took place in a chapel that had forgotten its god and kept its benches. He asked her what Earth teaches 14-year-olds about power. She said that it comes from votes and vigilance and from being the kind of person who keeps showing up even when it's boring. He nodded as if revising a line in his own book. We tell ours that power is a promise you must renew before breakfast. The third meeting stranded them in a service corridor during a fire drill that turned out to be a test of the building's dignity. They leaned on opposite walls like people in a movie who should kiss and instead agree to fix the plumbing. You know they'll ask you to save them, Mara said, meaning governments and their favorite reflex. We will refuse like neighbors, Cade replied. We will bring shovels and soup and a choir. We will not bring a leash. She nodded and thought, not for the first time, that refusing to be a god is the final exam most legends fail. Then came the message that wasn't a message so much as a mood. Vesper twitched again. The observatory watched the cymatics of the belt's skin redraw themselves. This time the ripple moved purposefully, not attack language. It shaped itself into a pattern Asterion used for internal notes, coming in haste but not in panic. A line formed in the data, shroud rising. Professor Vale said, "That's a poetic name," and then he looked pale because he remembered who named it. The shroud was a failure state Vesper scientists whispered about after their second drink. A cascade where folds recruited other folds like a rumor, darkening lanes and slicing conclusions away from beginnings. The prediction charts said it was a once-in-a-century tantrum. The new data said the century had arrived early. Practicum 2 became something else without asking. The council task group folded their skepticism into their uniforms and flew toward the edges that required them. Earth's carriers tilted their noses into the wind like dogs alert to thunder. Asterian's choir warmed their interfaces with the tenderness of musicians touching instruments that had played funerals and weddings and wanted mostly to play afternoons. Cade addressed them all quietly. "You have practiced refusing harm," he said. "Now you will practice refusing to define success as a headline. Hold the line. Let the shroud see in us a conversation it cannot shame into noise." Mara stepped into the chorus again because she knew what leaders ought to do, and because the choir had taught her to hear the shape of her own stubbornness. This time, the interface asked her for a different memory. The moment she realized she had admired someone not because they were right, but because they apologized well. She thought of a captain who had taught her that survival is a group grade. The room matched her remembrance and fed it into the engine that warms reality's colder parts. They sang with restraint, and the shroud paused. It's a strange thing to steady a universe that doesn't know it's wobbling. Parts of the mesh went dark and then came back, like a person deciding to keep participating. A Krari officer whispered a prayer from a tradition that broke and was mended before any of them were born. A Daryl scientist cried without embarrassment and took measurements with hands that had lectured 1,000 students on proper distance. The shroud bowed to patience and left. No medals were minted. They held a debrief in the same room with the bad coffee and made the coffee better. Someone put out fruit. Someone else replaced the chairs with ones that didn't pretend spines were expendable. They recorded lessons not as bullets but as sentences. We agreed to this because we decided to trust each other and because the risk of not trusting was larger. We won because no one tried to. We learned because we were willing to be taught by the part of ourselves we insult when we call it only soft. After midnight, news feeds asked whether Asterian had saved the day. The official answer was an annoying truth. Everyone did. The unofficial answer breathed in the homes of people who slept easier because the sky didn't fall. On the way to his quarters, Cade paused by the taped drawing again and touched the taped corner that had come loose. He smoothed it down as if smoothing down a world's flyaway hair. He whispered to no one and to everyone, "Tomorrow we practice listening again." The building settled. The belt slept. The galaxy, restless, dreamed of being good at hard things. It is a cliché that the galaxy tests you right after you pass the test you trained for. Ren's gap had been practice, and the shroud had been a lab practical, and the thing that came after had no syllabus. It didn't arrive with a resonant signature or a crisp hello. It arrived as a silence where busy should have been. 3 systems in the lamina spur went dim. Not dead, dim, like a city that has decided to whisper. Traffic vanished from lanes that had been arguing over right-of-way for a century. Stations reported power, air, morale, and then stopped reporting because the part of them that reported forgot why. The council ran diagnostics and found nothing wrong. Asterian listened a different way and heard an old tune half-sung and then abandoned, a memetic construct that had learned to eat attention. Memetics frightened professionals because you couldn't point a missile at them. They frightened ordinary people because your own mind is where you keep yourself. The construct, someone labeled it the hush because naming is a way to invite a thing to behave, was a leftover from a war the council had won mostly by erasing its vocabulary. It had persisted in low-energy pockets, singing itself to sleep and waking when a passing thought hummed the chorus. The hush didn't kill. It suggested forgetting as a form of survival, and then it asked the mind gently to practice. Asterian knew the song. Exile trains you to recognize the melodies that make you lonely politely. Cade convened a cross team in minutes. The council sent experts who remembered the old fight and younger scientists curious to see if their elders' ghost stories had rhyme schemes. General Hale joined because he had stopped pretending some rooms did not need him. Mara took a seat at the back and then moved to the front when someone asked for a human who could say hard things softly. The plan they wrote looked unambitious because ambition isn't always the healthy impulse. It proposed to go to the lamina spur not with a spear but with a choir, a clinic, and a promise. The spear would have worked faster, but only if you defined work as shut up the symptom and ignore the cause. The cause was old hunger for relief. The relief it offered was sleep with the light off. They went. The Asterian vessel that led the convoy hummed its way into the dim like a person stepping into a library to find a friend who keeps forgetting their name. The first station they visited had a mural made by hands that still remembered color. It was covered in gray paper. Mara tore a tiny corner and felt guilt like someone stealing a bandage to check the wound. Beneath the paper, children had painted a field with too much yellow to be fashionable and a ship with crooked windows that meant they drew it laughing. She put the paper back and wiped her hands on the air. The hush greeted them the way fog greets lighthouses, with indifference and the dream of swallowing. The choir offered the antidote it had been practicing since exile, a layered hum that reminded minds they were allowed to remember joy without apology. The clinic deployed counselors trained in unglamorous arts, rest, food with taste, a hand that knows when to squeeze. Asterian's technicians found the construct's resonant pockets and threaded counter patterns through local systems. Not erasing, not scorning, not mocking, just inviting the hush to rest after rest stopped being medicine. On day 2, a Daryl philosopher, those exist, they keep civilizations from stepping on their own tongues, stood in the station's canteen and asked for silence. "This is not a disease," she said. "It's a habit that became proud. We will cure it like we cure pride, with accurate stories and soup." The hush resisted when anyone tried to sharpen the work into spectacle. It got louder when someone brought in a camera to explain it to wide audiences in simple terms that made complexity feel like an accusation. It quieted when someone turned the camera off and said, "I'm here. Tell me where it hurts when you try to think." Asterian logged the measurements anyway because you take notes even in church. On day 3, a child asked Mara the question that had been pacing the room like an animal looking for a way out. "Did you do this?" She could have parsed the pronouns and placed the blame on ghosts. She told the truth the way she had been trying to learn to tell it. "We made the hush a long time ago," she said. "We starved it by refusing to sing its song. We forgot to teach your parents what it sounded like." The child nodded as if adults were finally catching up. Children forgive faster if you admit you messed up before they have to become historians. By day 5, the Lamina Spur remembered how to argue about parking. The hush folded itself into the corners where unattended sorrow sleeps and stopped recruiting. Asterian published the treatment protocol in a file so boring it could not possibly be an ad, and the council adopted it without changing the title. A spate of think pieces declared the age of kinetic heroism over and replaced by the age of therapy. A veteran on a Ganymede barstool told a reporter to take a long walk off a short dock, and then said a kinder thing when the reporter didn't leave. "It's not therapy. It's maintenance. We kept waiting for history to get less dirty. Turns out you just clean as you go." The only casualty came from an old reflex. One of the Kazathi captains, impatient with humming and soup, pushed a directed energy pulse at a cluster of resonance pockets. The hush rebounded and climbed the ladder the pulse offered. 4 crew on his ship forgot the words for each other for 27 hours. They came back, and the captain apologized in front of them with his voice shaking and his feathers flat, and it mattered that he did it publicly and first. At the end of the week, there was a party. Not a parade, no grand speeches, just a station's worth of people eating food that tasted like celebration. Someone strung light chords across the canteen, and someone else tuned an instrument that had to be explained to half the room. Mara danced without expertise and with the happiness of a person who had spent too long making the world safe for dignity, and finally found some left over for her feet. Cade didn't dance. He stood to the side, the way men who have learned to be landmarks sometimes do, and watched a group of adolescents teach a Crary scientist the part of a line dance that makes you look ridiculous and therefore proves you earn the laughter. When the song ended, he looked at Mara and made a small motion with his head toward the airlock. She followed, They walked along a service ring where you could hear the station breathe. Cade spoke first. "We didn't leave to become superior," he said. "We left because we weren't allowed to keep trying to be decent under pressure." He chuckled, a soft noise like a man who has told himself the joke long enough to get past its bitterness. "Turns out exile is pressure. You came back because you want help," Mara said. "We came back because we want witnesses," he corrected, and then, after a beat, "and because it is boring to be right alone." She leaned on the rail and watched a tug nose a cargo drum the way a sheepdog nudges a ewe. She said the things she had written and not sent. "What does it cost to build a choir that knows when to be quiet?" "Everything noisy," he said. "Every cleverness that wants applause. Every moment when I could win with a trick and choose instead to teach with a delay." He looked at his hands as if he were reading a line only he could see. "We pay it every day because the receipt is a world where fewer mothers have to memorize speech they should never need." The party went on behind them, proof that problems cure poorly without cake. They stood there until the glitter and the sweat cooled, and the room began to smell like the next morning. On the long flight home, Mara slept the way you only sleep when someone else is flying and you trust them. In his own cabin, Cade slept the way you only sleep when you have trained your mind to put itself in a drawer and close it gracefully. Between them, the galaxy counted the number of rooms where people had agreed to be taught and found the number larger than last week. When they landed, Hale sent a message that made Mara smile for the first time in too many days. "The Assembly wants to rename the day of open folders. I suggested the day of we start over. It lost. They picked Memory Day. I can live with it. So could everyone, it turned out, because holidays aren't for accuracy, they are for permission. On Memory Day, adults told the stories badly at first and then better. Children made art that administrators attempted and failed to tidy. Council delegates wore pins that meant I will try not to lie today. The hush receded from headlines. The drills continued, quietly bettering fleets that had learned the virtue of being boring. And in a region of the belt that still refused to dress up as simple, a fluctuation uncoiled like a snake waking warm. The observatory watched. The choir tuned. The next lesson didn't scare them as much as the idea of forgetting what they had just learned. Endings need work. The galaxy, like all classrooms, loves to play with the idea of a final exam, but history keeps being a group project. The Accord of Candor went from draft to doctrine without a parade because confetti and vacuum resents the species that invented it. The council ratified it with language precise enough to annoy lawyers and human enough to comfort grandmothers. Truth first, rehearsals labeled, consent logged, power explained, constraints celebrated as the heroism it is. Earth signed with the steadiness of a planet trying to be a person and left the seat next to its name empty for the exiles to occupy if they chose to sit. Asterion didn't sit. Orion Cade declined a chair and accepted a different kind of seat, a standing invitation to the meeting right before the meeting, where agendas are edited into honesty. He sent other people to the big room, ethicists with patient eyes, engineers with ink on their hands, a poet who had become the kind of administrator you trust with your favorite mispronounced words. "Send your general," Hale had suggested. Cade smiled. "We have them," he said, "but today you need teachers." What took longer was the interior work, the way navies rewrote manuals so that every scenario began with a line about what dignity would require. The way schools drew new maps with the Vesper region not as a blank, but as a neighbor. The way families found themselves arguing with more kindness because their children were watching. The Harkali kept their posture, and some of their suspicion, and adopted 3 Asterian liaison teams into their training institute because results outlast opinion. The Lucari admitted that waiting can be a tactic and not a failure. The Darrell hosting academies altered their entrance exams so that fast learners had to demonstrate the slower art of apology. Mara moved into a role with a long title that boiled down to professional patience. She wore less braid and more comfortable shoes. She visited schools on Wednesdays and told rooms of fidgeters that the difference between secrets and privacy is consent. She talked to captains on Fridays about rehearsals that stop being practice and start being addiction. She stopped answering every message and started mentoring 3 people who would outgrow her, and that was the point. On the first anniversary of Memory Day, she returned to Idris, not for a summit but for a conversation that felt like a summit because both people involved were tired and still in love with the work. Cade met her in the observatory's garden where someone had convinced plants to forgive artificial light. They walked in circles because circles are how minds turn sentences into conclusions. "I keep waiting for the day this stops needing me," Mara said. "It won't," Cade said. "We built the choir so it can sing without me. That was the hardest part. The second hardest is accepting that someone will always need to tune it." She thought about the taped drawing on his bulkhead. "Do you still have that?" she asked. "In a frame," he said, "which I hate, but the tape dried and I am learning to accept that some things you save for their own sakes." They reached the far bench, the one that faced the model of the belt, and sat. Mara pulled a folded sheet of paper from her pocket. Real paper. It had creases and a stain that smelled like tea. "I wrote this a year ago," she said. "I didn't send it. I didn't know if I wanted to ask a question or write a prayer." She handed it over. He smiled at the line about choir and quiet. "You asked what it costs," he said. "I told you everything noisy, may I amend. It costs everything noisy that keeps us from hearing the soft things that keep us alive." He folded the paper back as if returning a small animal to its nest. "I brought you something," he said, and held out a stone the size of his thumb, smooth as if water had been patient. "Vesper Beach," he said, and she blinked because no one had told her Vesper had beaches. "They happen when the folds line up and the sand pretends to be obedient." She held it and felt foolishly like she had been handed a piece of permission. The rest of the work was less cinematic, which was proof it was real. Practicums turned into curricula. Choir slots were open to any fleet that could pass the consent exam, which was harder than the technical one, and that was by design. The number of kinetic skirmishes dropped because people who can end a fight before it starts stop confusing restraint with boredom. The number of parades dropped, too, and nobody missed them as much as the vendors had worried. Asterians seated listening posts not as surveillance, but as gifts to the fabric. The posts carried nothing unless a system asked, and when they carried, they did so with an audit trail you could read in a primary school. Tyrants hate receipts. The receipts stayed. Not everything learned how to behave. A gate cult in the outer ribbon tried to summon a myth they had mistaken for a god and found themselves surrounded by a choir politely reminding the air how to remember itself. A mining combine refused to rewrite its emergency protocols and had to listen to a council tribunal read out the new charter like a bedtime story that would put no one to sleep. Asterian occasionally snapped at meetings when someone asked them to be miracle vending machines, and then apologized with the kind of thoroughness only people who have practiced contrition like a sport can manage. The last flare came, as last flares do, not to end the story but to give it a counterpoint. A star in a quiet arm began to stutter, a prelude to a tantrum that would crack the small world religious pilgrims had turned into a new hometown. The old response would have argued about funding, then jurisdiction, then which team got to write the paper. The new response moved like a volunteer army that had agreed to be led by accountability. Asterian arrived with a choir. The council arrived with engineers. Earth arrived with food and tents, and the decision not to name the tents after politicians. They stabilized the star's temper the way you soothe a singer with tea and kindness and a stern reminder to breathe from the diaphragm. The world stayed, the pilgrims stayed, the paper got written by the intern who had noticed the thing all the experts had decided was a rounding error. The intern's name appeared first. Everyone clapped at the right time for the right reasons. This is not a fairy tale. It is how competent people behave when they remember they owe each other mornings. On a night without crisis, standing in a human room with air that had almost learned to be sweet, Mara recorded a message for children whose teachers would show it because they were too tired to invent something better, and because tired teachers are why civilizations don't fail. She said, "We thought power was proof. It isn't. It's presence. It's the will to show up before the fire and after the news cycle. We exiled people who refused to stop showing up, and they became the kind of humans who could walk back into a room and make it bigger. If you are 14 and angry, you are invited. If you are 80 and sorry, you are invited. If you are tired and think the world should be kinder than it is, you are already in the choir. Practice is how we sing without hurting anyone." She sent it and did not read the comments. In a different room with fewer windows and more metal, Orion Cade spoke into a recorder he used because writing made him feel young and talking made him feel responsible. He said, "We didn't become better because we were alone. We became better because being alone forced us to become honest. We came back not with a throne, but with a sentence we wanted to hear repeated in 1,000 accents. We remember. The rest is curriculum design and cooking for people when they are sad." He didn't send it either. He put it on a shelf next to a framed drawing with tape underneath, because some things deserve a shrine even if you don't believe in shrines. The galaxy did not declare a golden age. It declared a Tuesday, and then another, and then a series of days where people practiced not breaking what they wanted to keep. The choir sang when asked and was quiet when that was the gift. The hush learned to nap in safe places. The belt kept its mischief, because some wilderness is a teacher, and teachers shouldn't all retire. On the second anniversary of Memory Day, the council accidentally scheduled a budget hearing on the same date. The hearing began with a motion to change the agenda. Cade abstained from the vote he had been offered as a courtesy he didn't want, and Mara laughed in a room where laughter had learned to earn its keep. The budget passed. The work continued. In a school on a small station near an old battle site, a child wrote a sentence that would end up on a wall 6 administrations later. They printed it on a banner because some words do deserve cloth. The sentence didn't sound like a revelation. It sounded like a list kept on a fridge. "We don't survive by winning. We survive by practicing." Asterion drifted where it drifted, within and slightly aside. The council held meetings that more often felt like conversations than confessions. Earth made mistakes out loud and corrected them before they grew teeth. Mara slept sometimes, and when she didn't, she walked gardens that forgave fluorescent light. Hale retired slowly and loudly and then quietly kept showing up, because some habits are a gift disguised as a refusal. And when the next anomaly rippled through the fabric, there were more hands than last time and more names in the log and more lunches packed by more parents who had learned to be less afraid of their children asking, "Why did you hide it?" The answer had gotten shorter. "We won't," they said. "Help us practice." Somewhere at the edge of a fold, a ship turned with the patience of a thing that knows time has to be courted, not commanded. In its hull, 100 tiny lights blinked the color for ready with consent. A voice, not broadcast, not recorded, just spoken to the air because ritual matters, said the word that had started classes for 1,000 years and only recently started wars. "Begin."